Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to look at a movement I'm calling anti-mysticism. My guest, once again, is James Tunney, artist, poet, scholar, and barrister. He is the author of The Mystical Accord, Sutras to Suit Our Times, Lines for Spiritual Evolution. He's also written two dystopian novels, Blue Lies September and Ireland, I Don't Know Who She Is. He's lectured on legal matters all over the world as a senior lecturer in law. Welcome, James.
Thank you very much again, Jeffrey. Appreciate you having me.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, truly.
Thank you.
And I hope that you are able to come back to Albuquerque many more times in the future.
I really look forward. It's a fantastic place. Thank you. Thank you.
So, anti-mysticism, as a parapsychologist, I'm aware of the anti-mystical movement because many people equate parapsychology with mysticism, rightly or wrongly. Many parapsychologists take offense at that. They don't wish to be associated with all kinds of mysticism, but usually the complaint is something like you're promoting the rising tide of superstition.
Yes. And I understand and I have total respect for parapsychologists who work within a very strict, as they all do in relation to scientific methodology and have to prove themselves and publish in the standard scientific journals. They have to play by their rules. So I understand their need to protect themselves and to adhere to the strictures of the discipline. I don't believe that we can ignore those. We have to deal with them as we find them. So I don't have any problem with parapsychologists being hyper-scientific to protect the integrity of the subject as it's growing. But the real criticism comes from people like Ayn Rand. Now, I remember reading her years ago, and the mysticism, when I read what she wrote about mysticism, it obviously registered subconsciously in some way, but it didn't register on the level that it did when I revisited it.
Perhaps for the benefit of viewers who aren't familiar with Ayn Rand, let's summarize a bit of when she lived and who she was.
Well, the main things for me is she was an immigrant. She came from Russia, and the main philosophy, she sought. She was very philosophically orientated. So she sought to develop a unique philosophy, focusing on the idea of knowledge. But the focus of that philosophy was objectivism. And for her, it was very important, and in view of her view of history, to focus on things which were provable, which were observable, which were empirical, on facts, and to avoid anything which couldn't be demonstrated, and to focus on self-interest as the driving force, the driving motivation for social development. So in many ways, her philosophy was very in tune with the capitalist intent in the United States. So she's often celebrated by people who are successful in business, and we can see in her various novels, the Fountainhead and the other ones.
Atlas Shrugged.
Yes. We can see this belief that the people who create things should be rewarded and not impeded. Now, I agree with a lot of those points in relation to not having an overpowerful state. So there's a lot of things I would agree with her on. I agree with the necessity for individuals to function in the material world, to be successful, to pay attention to their finances, to pay attention to all their basic needs on Maslow's pyramid, to ensure as far as possible that they adequately anticipate their shelter needs and the needs for their future and for retirement and health, etc. I agree with all that. And I agree with the emphasis on creativity and the need that every society has to produce new things. But when she talked about mysticism, she created a very wide definition which seemed to include all religion. So anything which was not that objective scientific, well, particularly objective in that sense, should be disregarded, and it would therefore, I suppose, disregard, as far as I could tell, a lot of subjective experience which would not associate with self-interest. Mm-hmm. And so that's the core kind of philosophical base for the discussion. But the key thing was a wide definition of mysticism, which would actually include all religion, as far as I
never studied her in depth, but my sense is that one of her main points is that large mass movements tend to discourage individual creativity. It's as if the ignorant masses are trying to pull down the creative efforts of the brilliant few.
Well, I'm not criticizing her for her focus on the individual, because it's the same. I celebrate that focus on the individual. I have no problem with that. I share that. Yeah. The facilitation of the individual has to be the basis, in my view. But she ignores some points in that. I'll give you one example. If you want to become a very successful inventor, you have come up with a new teleportation machine. You have invented it. You are that individual. You are concentrating on your self-interest. You get this invention. In order to exploit it commercially, you're going to have to get a patent. The patent gives you a monopoly for 20 years. But the point is, a lot of these people she's talking about are getting support from the state system in order to gain their wealth. They won't be able to gain the wealth to continue the cycle of growth without some infrastructure. So she seems to ignore. I agree there should be a minimal amount of rules as far as possible to facilitate interaction, but that doesn't mean you abolish everything altogether. And there's a strange irony, I think, in that in one of the novels she has the characters disappearing and moving away and going into the wilderness, which kind of reflects what mystics do. Maybe when they go into the wilderness long enough, they'll turn mystical. I don't know. Mm-hmm. But there's a bit of an irony about that. And there's a bit of an irony about their failure to see that, as Newton said, that he was, as far as I remember, was Newton, that he was on the shoulders of giants. That they get the benefit from all the infrastructure, which is which slowly grows up like a coral reef over. Yeah. So she dismisses that.
Well, I gather she dismisses mysticism and all religion because of its lack of consistency with her philosophy of objectivism.
Yes, and in that sense, you have to ask, if you approach it from a pragmatic perspective, you'd say, well, what are the consequences of this view? If you say, well, take this view, what are the consequences? Now, for me, her view perfectly suits the ambition of science. It's the other side of the coin in many ways of the scientism that I would argue against, if it's taken in a very narrow form. Yeah. So it could be that her objectivism is exactly what a person from a very scientific managerial perspective might emphasize.
We had an interesting conversation last night with my nephew, a scientist at Los Alamos, and what he suggested is that actually scientists claim very often not to be religious at all. They despise religion often, but they adhere to the religion of scientism. That is their religion.
Yes, that's an important point, and it was a very well made point, and I was delighted to hear that awareness from someone who works in very complex areas of molecular chemistry, etc. So that's correct. And you might argue that there's always going to be a God. We're just arguing about the nature of what that God is. There's always going to be something that we worship. And you say, we don't worship anything. We're rational. We're reasonable. But we worship money, or we worship power, or we worship control, so there is some driving goal which supersedes, which people aim for. So, I don't think that going to be able to substitute and have nothing in its place. The evidence from history is that there's always something above the person, which is put there, whether it be an ideology or something else. So it's not going to be a vacuum.
Yeah. In the 18th century, we had in Western Europe this notion of the Enlightenment. In the 18th, I think, in the 19th century too. The idea that rationality was going to be the supreme human faculty, and if we could just live our lives rationally, everything would be in accordance with justice.
Yeah.
And it didn't turn out so well.
Well, that was about the time they were chopping all the heads off of people and using the rational guillotine to end opposition to the new order. And when they had a Temple of Reason in Paris, it's where they were going to worship reason. So, yes. And the problem that I have is about the nature of reason. For me, reason is a tool. It's an instrument to gain something else. And this is an important point in relation to the nature of knowledge or the nature of objectives. So if the scientocracy is to happen in the future, what world government, for example, would look like would be that the world government, whether it be a artificially intelligent chief executive with notional input from some representative, some scientific elite, that party system will have objectives. So they will state the objective. And the artificial intelligence, which will surpass human decision-making power, won't be constrained by any notions of morality, because we know that scientists have a philosophical problem with the notion of morality. So if the objective is to reduce human population, they will do so, and they will do so very efficiently. But it mightn't be something that we would want to witness, God forbid. But that's the danger that we have to realistically consider if we look at the consequence of being objective. Because the idea of being objective, you have an object to get somewhere else. You're going there it's not an end in itself. So there's not an end process we're getting to. And I would also remind people, again, on both sides, in fascism and in communism, science was there. And if we look at Stalinism and that, we have to think in terms of descriptions of scientific socialism. And in fact, scientists were very productive and very useful to Stalin and helped and had, in fact, great accomplishments and great contributions. They could still function, no problem, under a tyrannous, murderous regime. So, and then we have the horrendous examples of the scientists in the Nazis regime. And we noticed that after the Second World War, the scientists in other countries, not least here, were very willing to take scientists who had been involved in crimes against humanity into their fold. And we know about the operation which took a lot of Nazi scientists over.
Operation Paperclip.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we know that Werner von Braun was behind NASA and various other things. So and also the exploration and the anticipation of the moon landings, helping Walt Disney, for example.
Wait, what do you suggest? The moon landing helping Walt Disney?
Before the moon landing, Walt Disney and NASA worked on a video explaining what was going to happen. I'm not suggesting the moon landing didn't happen.
I just want to be clear about that.
No, but what I'm saying, they were transformed. They went through some magic door. They could excuse their morality, and they could excuse the things. And also, the horrific medical experiments that were done in Auschwitz and places like that. They've taken the information. You can say, well, that's pragmatic, but, the fruits of a but
now the critics of mysticism would say the whole Nazi regime is an example of what happens when superstitious ideas take over a culture. You're saying it's not that simple.
No. And also, it ignores the role that scientific theory had in the evolution of these movements. That if you look even at the theory of evolution, it was in a milieu of looking at race superiority. So they've very happily cut out ideas that were lurking around of eugenics and a race from they've stripped the bad bits that they had in. And even if you look in the early 20th century, when the British Medical Society moved to its new headquarters near Russell Square, they took over the buildings of the Theosophical Society. And as far as I remember reading in the early agendas of the General Council or whatever it is, they were discussing issues such as eugenics and all that in a way that they wouldn't be proud of today. So let's not ignore the contributions of science to these things. And when we talk about mysticism, define what we're talking about. And I think I'm trying to distinguish between an idea of a group and an idea of an individual. Yeah. If I'm constantly arguing about it being an individual self-development with respect for others, it can't come in the general definition that Ayn Rand or someone else.
Well, I think there's no doubt that amongst the anti-mystical camps, the scientific camp, the camp of rational thinkers are very dominant.
Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of the Claims of the Paranormal prides itself on rationalism.
Yes.
And so on. It was incidentally founded out of the humanist movement, which, as I recall, was an outgrowth of people in the American Communist Party.
Yes. Yeah.
I forget the name of the philosopher. I'll post his book, who was one of those individuals. But there are other anti-mystical camps. For example, Freudians, even though Freud himself had a strong interest in the paranormal and in parapsychology, at one point he said if he could do it all over again, he'd want to study telepathy. But at the same time, the classical Freudian notion of mysticism was that it was not an evolved state at all. It was what they called a regression to an oceanic oneness of the infant.
Yes, yeah. And also, he did write that essay on the uncanny, unheimlich, or that essay on the uncanny, where he's thinking about what the idea of uncanniness and what's strange, which is kind of relevant again in the context of sex dolls and all that. And that point, the uncanny valley, as they call it, which is a point where it looks like a human's not quite there and it makes people uncomfortable. But that's another. But in relation to Freud, when you look at Freud, for example, one thing that Freud and Jung shared in common, this is an odd thing, but when I was looking at Rome, they were both very afraid to go to Rome. They had a phobia of going to Rome. It's quite interesting. When I was looking at, it was an odd thing that came up. So Sigmund Freud wasn't always practicing what he preached, and my sympathies would be certainly towards the Jungian perspective in that. I don't think
much more open to the mystical,
mystical, able to see, for example, that. Animan, animus, feminine, masculine in everybody, different, and that's another point that in relation to the history of mysticism, women have played a profound role. So despite exclusion in other contexts, they've often led the way, in the context of mysticism, and probably been persecuted as well, as were the male mystics. But it's an interesting.
Well, and amongst male mystics, you often had amongst shamans, amongst mystics like Ramakrishna in India, cross-dressers, men who had very feminine characteristics.
Yes, and there was always the esoteric and spiritual idea that the spirit didn't have the sex characteristics, or had two characteristics. I think, as far as I remember reading in relation to the Native Americans, when they were talking about homosexual people, they believed they had two spirits, not one. So it's a more complex notion. Yeah. But certainly they have a history of openness towards the masculine and the feminine, because they see it as a kind of yin-yang process, the same as they would see nature.
Yes, when one gets in touch with one's self, one's essence as the ground of all being, equal to the ground of all being of the whole universe, as the Vedantists would say, Brahman equals Atman, then the whole idea of having prejudices with regard to gender roles sorts of falls away.
Well, if we come to a conclusion and manage some way to, as if there was some kind of big central beam of light through both of us, which was our pure consciousness. If we just saw that pure consciousness, it couldn't have any real identity, except I think that I believe that the idea, and associated with a Christian idea, is that the proper accord of the heart would in some way imprint on the spirit, or is meant to, and that determines its nature in some sense. So that but the point being, of course, the pure consciousness couldn't be a particular thing. Then it wouldn't have a name. It's beyond time. It's beyond time and space in some ways, but it's certainly beyond birth certificates, and that's for a different dimension, for the material world and for those necessary functions.
So there's a sense in which any group of people, organization that is based on some attachment to some aspect of identity, and that being primary over and above any other consideration, are going to be at that level anti-mystical.
They could be if they took a very simplified approach, but I would hope that people who can engage in complex cosmopolitan thought would be able to identify the subtleties and nuances in such arguments and realize that it was not meant to reduce in any way or disrespect any particular identities that people wanted to identify. But if you look at Martin Luther King, for example, he was very, very clear about not wanting to transcend the superficial differences, to recognize the pre-existing consciousness and spirit in the individual. And another example is Frederick Douglass, who, of course, went to Ireland. He was a slave in the United States. He went to Ireland. He said it was the first place he was treated as an equal in his life. And the irony for him was that the conditions of the peasants in the west of Ireland were worse than anything he'd ever seen under slavery or in any other context, and it opened his eyes. But he was invited there by Daniel O'Connell as well, who shared the same view about the individual and protecting the individual, irrespective of any identification. So I suppose in a Buddhist way, the Buddhists would say that you can become attached to an identification and it becomes a distraction. Again, with total respect to anyone's ability to identify with what they want to identify. It's up to them.
So there are a range of anti-mystical movements. We talked in a previous interview about the dark side of mysticism, and I think some people are against all mysticism because they see these dark examples, gurus who have a sort of cult-like negative influence over their followers. Jonestown, where
I was just thinking
people committed mass suicide at the direction of a guru. Sometimes people look at various mystical traditions and that's what they see.
My argument would be, so I was just reflecting on Jim Jones and the Guyana tragedy, and I suppose there's that film at the moment, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and there's a reference to Charles Manson and all that kind of scenario. So, there's this idea of a figure led by a cult figure, although it may have been overblown in the Manson case, which is another story. But say take Jim Jones as a better example in relation to someone who leads to obviously and directly to mass suicide. I have always stressed, and I always will stress, that the individual is responsible for their actions. Responsibility is important. So the individual has to protect themselves. The individual cannot relinquish their controls to somebody else, to some group. They can't. They're responsible for that. And another point might be that if one is aware of one's own unique body, mind, soul, spirit, it should make it harder to give that away to someone else who is going to give you the path, especially if they're operating on your fear, if they're because if a person goes on a spiritual path, they will become more secure, not less secure. It's the same as if one engages in the martial arts, they will become more relaxed about their ability to defend themselves, not less. And they can ignore those issues. So, those dangers are there. The cult things we all have to be very, very careful about. But then the cult is more representative of people who haven't been developing, who have been weakened or vulnerable in particular, and are therefore open to being manipulated in that sense.
Yeah. Well, there's so many paradoxes associated with these things, because sometimes the very people who are promoting the individual, like Ayn Rand, are also the ones who are anti-mystical.
Yes, and what I couldn't understand about her idea was that if you're saying, okay, we're going for individual liberty, well, why would she criticize the liberty of people to practice their religion? It doesn't make sense. So it seemed to be a very narrow sense of liberty, and a very narrow materialist sense. And I'm saying, and I've met some people who are very dogmatic Ayn Rand supporters, and they think that what she has written was the best things ever written, and they would certainly put it far above spiritual text. But I'm looking at Ayn Rand's books, and I'm saying, well, what kind of a person does this produce? And the composite I come up with was someone that is like Ebenezer Scrooge, and maybe King Midas, because when they get all their material wealth, they won't be able to enjoy anything else about it because they've sacrificed all the other values. And also perhaps Mr. Gradgrind from Hard Times, who said it's facts, everything in the education system, everything is about facts. Yes, but there's other things. It's like the sutras, that is, it's a thread or something that sews together, something knit together, or like a necklace with things on it. But, so that, I think that's, the analogy could be made.
Really, before we conclude our discussion about anti-mysticism, we need to talk about not just Freud, but the profession of psychiatry, the tendency there is in the whole mental health system where if somebody begins reporting mystical experiences, they get identified as psychotic.
Well, it was interesting because I remember Wilson von Dusen, and that was very interesting.
I knew Wilson von Dusen.
I know, name drop. I was thinking about that because this is very relevant in the context. And I was listening to a very moving documentary about an Irish traditional musician, a great musical tradition called Liam Clancy. I don't know if you heard of them. So the Clancy brothers were very, very famous. They came from the countryside over to America and took it by storm. They had significant patrons, which is another interesting story. So they came with traditional music, and they were genuine, skilled traditional music, singing traditional songs, and they became famous. So they played in New York, and Bob Dylan, or as Bob Zimmerman, as Liam Clancy used to say, used to come into the pub, I don't know, it was a White Horse or something in New York, and listen to the music. And in fact, Bob Dylan said that he got the sense of rebelliousness in his music from listening to the Clancys in the thing. And you can see, and he took some old Irish ballads as well in his music, that kind of feisty thing. So Liam Clancy had some problems, maybe with drinking or whatever, and he described an experience where he knew he had a problem, and he ended up going to a psychiatric hospital, and a famous psychiatrist in Ireland, Professor Ivor Brown, as far as I remember. There are a few good, famous, well-known, respected psychiatrists, like Professor Anthony Clare is a man I had great respect for, who I interviewed before, who's dead now, but he was a fantastic man. But Liam Clancy said he was going to a famous Irish pub called O'Donoghue's, where bands like the Dubliners used to sing. Have you ever met them?
No.
Well, I used to do it. I drank with them till 7 o'clock in the morning. So anyway, he was going to the pub, and then he had an out-of-body experience whereby he felt himself dissociating from, so it was clearly a medical thing that needed attention. But then I'm listening to some of the other descriptions where people are saying, well, actually, this is a phenomenon of higher order spiritual things. And you see that it becomes complex. And certainly there's plenty of evidence that people, we'll take the example of Vincent Van Gogh. So Vincent Van Gogh, people forget, was a priest early on who worked in the mining communities. So he was very into religion, and then he goes through various evolutions, and he becomes a painter. He was a proper mystic who was informed by before.
Yes, his artwork expresses a sense of seeing scintillating energy wherever he looks.
Yes. So although people focus on the tragedy and on whatever happened, and it's not the full story, and it's not represented, and we don't know what medical problems he have had that may have been unbearable. We can look at all the letters to Theo and whatever.
His brother Theo, who supported him.
And a mass amount of information. But he was a mystic on a mystical journey who provided a gift to humanity, and it seemed that the provision of that gift that was not obvious to people in his life, as manifested by the fact that he sold 2 paintings in his life, or whatever.
Today there's a museum in his honor in Amsterdam.
And his paintings have sold for huge, ridiculous amounts of money, but he still has a profound effect on people. So he was painting from the position of someone who was alienated from society, who couldn't maintain relationships with people around him, who fell out when he tried to set up an artist colony in the Yellow House in the south of France. He couldn't do it. Whose relationships broke down. He was unsuccessful in those senses. But it didn't take away from his pursuit of the core goal. And he wasn't unaware of that. And he knew in the future that people would see that. And he kept on doing that. Not for himself, obviously. He wasn't getting any benefit out. Maybe he would have prospered with financial support or recognition from the people around him. Maybe he would never have progressed in his paintings to the higher level that he did do, to the sunflower phase, etc.
Well, there is a sense, and we've discussed it previously, where great mystics often transcend all cultural norms. And so people who are attached to those norms are going to have problems with them. Yes,
that's correct. So at a certain point, well, obviously, if he's putting himself in that position, he has rejected, because he also worked in selling art in London. He lived in London for a while. So he wasn't unfamiliar with that world. He obviously saw it, and he wasn't. With someone like that who has that dedication, single-minded focus, the same as Rasputin, they will get their goals. So the point is, if he had wanted to be a successful bourgeoisie, whatever, gallery owner, he would have done that if he really he didn't want that. So that's an important point.
Often these people are going to put their whole life on the line.
Yes.
And it may cost them their life.
It will cost them their life, but and of course, suicide is an exceptional case in the thing. It's not a usual end for a mystical person, but that doesn't take away from the fact that he was on a spiritual path. I believe there was some other factor in the thing, and we don't know. There's so many. I know
you've pointed out that mysticism is an antidote to existential despair.
But the point is as well. He wouldn't have been able to get out of the bed in the morning if he didn't have that desire, that love of beauty. You mentioned, I didn't come back on this about joy. You talked about the Buddhists and pain and joy. The point is, pain and joy go to, if we didn't have pain, we wouldn't have joy. If we didn't have joy, we wouldn't have pain. So there is the yin yang there. And when the joy comes, we should take it and enjoy it. With good humor. And humor is often another characteristic associated with spiritual, but the suffering is there in different. It's different paths for different people.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know that he wasn't bitten by an insect sometime that caused. We don't know what happened to him, so we can speculate, but we won't know.
Well, I guess in concluding, I feel obliged to bring up the great example of Western culture, Jesus Christ.
Yes, yeah.
I no doubt was a mystic.
Well, of course. I mean, not only was he a mystic, but he was demonstrating his powers. Now, we can say that is only from God in that context, but it was God coming into human form. Maybe the point about the demonstration by certain spiritual leaders is to demonstrate that the human spirit has far more potential than we believe we have. And by the argument that we should focus on the spirit, the argument is that we should develop spiritually and evolve, and that it will not be strange that people can heal people. That's what they say, the healers say, for example. By focusing on compassion, non-violence, whatever. So, yes, and that may be some of the point. So, it would be strange if we had a religion which said, okay, our founder was able to do all these mystical things. We have some of these powers, but we think it's unchristian to do those things. That doesn't make sense to me. Yeah. And in relation to the existential question of how humanity is going to survive, maybe the only solution to that is for people to develop their extra powers. For who knows in what circumstance where people have to combat some risk that we've never contemplated, that is created as a result of the interaction of various forces that different people have unleashed without respect to the possibility of them coming together, that it may be some person who's 5 years old now, who's fascinated in computers, that is an expert in code somewhere along the line that can stop something happening. They may be our saviors in the future from their skills if their heart is in the right place.
James Tunney, what a pleasure once again. Yeah. I know these conversations, sometimes I hate to stop them because I know we could just keep going and going, and there's so much to talk about.
Yes.
I'm so glad that you're here with me. Thank you so much for being with me.
And to conclude on that, and of course we know that the greatest problems that the mystics may find is from in their own religions themselves. But I just want to say thank you very much, and to express my appreciation for another interview and a series of interviews. And as you pointed out when I came in, I'll be conscious of going back to Sweden and my family, and we'll be looking forward to maintaining communication. So I really want to thank you for that interview. Thank you.
My pleasure, truly. And thank you for being with us.